Good morning, even though it's technically 7:30 at night, let's make some raw pet food. If you've seen Chris from the Kit and Sunday channel make homemade raw food, I'm basically just copying her method because it looks nice and simple, and I like to keep things nice and simple and easy. So we're just gonna take some of the raw Feeding Miami boneless meats and we're gonna mix it with the essential blend from Hunde. It should be pretty straightforward. This should be the lazy girl version of making DIY homemade raw food, but I guess we're gonna find out together, so let's just go ahead and get started. So for the base, I have 2 pounds of raw ground rabbit and 2.5 pounds of raw ground venison, both without any bone. The mix I chose to balance the meat already includes an adequate amount of calcium, which is why I picked a meat base that didn't already have bone. But once we're all said and done, you can use something like a chicken foot or a duck neck or any other raw meaty bone if you wanted to, and it wouldn't unbalance the food. I got the meat online from Raw Feeding Miami, and I let them thaw in the fridge for 24 hours before using them, but obviously that wasn't quite long enough for the venison because it was still kind of frozen in the middle. I'm just gonna use my hands to break up the venison and mix the two meats together as much as I can, and yes, I'm wearing gloves for those of you who freak out when I don't use gloves when handling raw products. Just know I'm only doing it for you. With the bird flu outbreak, we're taking extra steps to ensure any raw products that we feed are safe, which is part of the reason I'm using a small company and making this myself at home, because we are avoiding larger brands. There have been wild hunted deer who tested positive for bird flu, so it can be a carrier, but the deer sourced through Raw Feeding Miami are farmed and the herds are tested for bird flu before they're harvested. I also think it's important to note that the meat I'm using here was purchased before the outbreak. However, if you're looking to make some DIY raw food now that the outbreak has happened and you don't want to give up on raw completely, I feel safe buying raw meat from Raw Feeding Miami. I have a whole Instagram highlight that talks all about bird flu, and we answer a bunch of questions about how we're personally handling it and taking steps to be safe. Short of it is, we're basically avoiding large companies and sticking to smaller places that have a closer eye on their manufacturing and facilities, and we're also avoiding any raw poultry, raw beef, and raw dairy. But this video isn't to talk about the bird flu. I can make an entire YouTube video if that's something you guys are interested in, about our thoughts and what our personal process is going to be, but definitely check out our highlight if you have more questions. Also, feel free to leave questions in the comments and I'll try to answer them there, but keep in mind I'm not a professional when it comes to bird flu. I'm just doing what makes me feel safe with my pets based on the research I've done. I'm not here to tell you what you should be doing with your pets. I'm just sharing what I'm doing with mine, and if that happens to match up with what you want to do, that's great. If not, that's totally fine too. Anyway, back to making the raw food. I'm going to separate the 3.5 pounds of meat that I have between Holly and Milkshake, and I'm giving Milkshake 1.5 pounds and Holly the remaining 2 pounds. When I was making this, I thought my ex-boyfriend took the kitchen scale when he left, so I bought a new one, and this one is way more sensitive and it's literally driving me insane. Because it's so super crazy sensitive, it's also really accurate, which I'm sure some of you would love, but as somebody who just wanted to see a whole number in order to move on to the next step, being off by 0.01 in either direction every single time was driving me insane. Now that I've sufficiently ranted about my hatred I have for the new kitchen scale, we can move on to the fun part, which is balancing the meat. I'm using the Hunde Essential Blend for dogs and cats, which again already includes calcium, so I'm using boneless meat, but if you wanted to add your own bone, they also have a Vital Blend that doesn't have calcium included, so either way, the brand has something that works for everyone. No, for those of you who are curious, this isn't sponsored, but hey, if they were looking for influencers, we would definitely take the opportunity. Use the feeding guidelines on the back to figure out how much powder from Hunde I needed for the amount of meat that I had, and you need 40 grams of Hunde for every 800 grams of meat. 3 pounds of meat is about 1,360 grams, so to figure out how much I needed of Hunde, I basically just set up a proportion and then cross-multiplied and divided. After doing all the math, you end up with about 68 grams of Hunde for 3 pounds of meat, which I just measured out on my super crazy annoying scale after zeroing it to make sure I got the perfect amount. Also threw in some of this Old Soul blend from Hunde, which doesn't balance the food, but it does provide extra benefits. So again, I just used the feeding guidelines on the back and the same process to figure out how much I would need to add to Holly's entire batch of food in order for it to be an effective and useful amount per serving. And in order to not bore you with another math lesson, I did the math and it ends up being about 40.8 grams. I rounded up to 41, and then I'm just gonna make sure everything is well incorporated when I do mix it together. I ended up accidentally going out of order when I was adding the balancing powders to Milkshake's food, which could have been a disaster, but somehow magically worked out. Thought I had picked up the essential blend, but I picked up the bonus product, which is the Liven Up powder that I just wanted to add for the extra benefits, but luckily I caught myself as I was adding it at literally the perfect time. Needed 27 grams of Essential Blend to balance Milkshake's food, which is what I thought I had in my hand, and 22.7 grams of the Liven Up for the bonus benefits. That was a happy accident. Luckily, I caught my mistake at exactly 22 grams of the Liven Up blend, so I just topped it off with the remaining 0.7, and like I said, it ended up being a happy accident, but that could have been a disaster. Okay, I lied. I'm gonna give you one more math lesson to show you how I figured out how much Essential Blend to use for Milkshake's food in case you guys are doing the same thing and are looking for a reference point. The guidelines say you need 40 grams of Essential Blend to every 1,000 grams of meat, and I have 680.4 grams of meat. So after doing the math of cross-multiplying and dividing, you end up with roughly 27.2 grams of essential powder needed to balance 1.5 pounds pounds of raw meat for cats. If you're looking at my scale thinking I'm not adding 27.2 grams of essential powder, it's because I made another mistake and started pouring in the essential blend without zeroing my scale, so I had to do an extra layer of math, but I promise it's the right amount. Leave it to me to be the person to somehow complicate the lazy and easy girl method of DIY raw food, but I honestly don't think any of us are surprised. Now that I finally have everything weighed out and I somehow have the proper amounts of everything, I'm gonna go ahead and give everything an incredibly thorough mix. Aside from double checking your math to make sure you're actually adding the proper amount of everything, making sure it's completely mixed together and well incorporated is the most important step. If you don't take the time to actually mix it in well enough, you won't have a balanced food because you'll have an uneven distribution of the products that we use to balance the raw meat. So it's worth taking the extra few minutes just to mix it one more time just to make sure. After I got everything all nice and mixed, I realized I only had this singular pair of gloves, so I kind of maybe went and washed my hands with the gloves just so that I could touch everything without getting raw meat on anything, but I did what I had to do. Anyway, now that everything is mixed and I have clean gloves, I'm gonna pre-portion everything into more manageable quantities. For milkshake, I use these little glass baby food containers that I got off of Amazon a couple of years ago. They hold 4 ounces, which is perfect because I typically feed milkshake 2 ounces at a time, so I get 2 servings out of each jar. I feed milkshake 2 ounces at a time because I typically add broth, hydration, and extra toppers, but if I'm not doing anything fancy, I do feed her the full 4 ounces. Milkshake walked over all curious, so of course I had to let her take a little sample of her raw food, and luckily it looks like it's gonna be milkshake approved. I'm just gonna go through and fill all of these containers as close to 4 ounces as I can possibly get, but with the crazy sensitive scale, I took way too long trying to make them perfect. Portioning out Holly's is a little easier because I'm either doing 1 pound or a half-pound containers since she eats a half-pound at a time. Again, I feed Holly a half-pound at a time, which feels a little light because I typically add extras and I want to accommodate for the extra calories. Don't worry, I don't ever add enough to unbalance the food, but enough to add extra benefits and add to the diet that she already has. After getting everything all weighed out, it was time to just pop the lids on the containers and pop these guys back in the freezer, but I did go back to Holly's food and ended up adding some cling wrap to the top of the meat since there was a little extra space in the containers. I ended up getting 12 meals for Milkshake and 6 meals for Holly, which for me is definitely worth the price for the ingredients and supplies that I used, and certainly worth the amount of time. Especially if I wasn't filming, this wouldn't have taken very long, and now that I've done the math, it'll be easier to do next time. Now that everything is prepped and put in the freezer, aside from what I'm going to use today and tomorrow, I'm going to clean up my workstation and sanitize everything with a pet-safe disinfectant. Both of them had a little bit of food left over after weighing everything to pre-portion it, so I figured I would use what was left to make little sample-sized bowls to make sure my effort wasn't wasted and they actually liked the food. Keep in mind, this is definitely not a meal, it's just something to let them try it, and it's more like a little snack. I already knew Milkshake liked it because she enjoyed the little piece I gave her earlier, and she kept trying to steal it from the bowl while I was portioning everything out. And I can't say I'm surprised that Holly loved it, since she's been really missing raw food since we took it out of her diet. I took Holly off of raw food when bird flu got serious because we were using larger brands, and I just didn't feel safe, but luckily she loved the DIY raw food, so I think we're gonna keep doing this. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what proteins we should try when this food runs out, and I'll see you next time.